When officers in Orland Park, Illinois, stormed a felon's small industrial office one cold February morning, they expected danger and darkness. But nothing prepared them for what waited in a cramped 6-by-6-foot room. A young bobcat, terrified, declawed, and forced to live among guns, drugs, and silence. Animal control rushed him to the vet, where the verdict was worse than anyone could have imagined. A declawed bobcat was doomed, unable to hunt, unable to survive, unable to ever be wild again. The young feline wasn't just a victim of neglect. He was a casualty of cruelty. This is the story of Mondovi and the desperate race to save a life the world had already written off. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The cold didn't just bite that February morning in Orland Park, Illinois. It tried to chew the men to the bone. Officer Mike Sullivan, 58 years old and just 2 years from a pension he dreamed about more than his wife, pulled the collar of his vest tighter. The industrial park was a graveyard of gray corrugated steel and salt-stained asphalt, dead silent at 6 a.m. Breach in 3, 2, 1. The ram hit the steel door with a hollow thud that felt wrong, followed by the metallic screech of the frame giving way. Sullivan was third man in, his senses flooded by the familiar script. The shouting, the smell of unwashed bodies and stale chemicals, the clatter of a knocked-over table. "Police! Hands up, don't move!" It was over in seconds. The two felons, dazed and blinking in the sudden light, were cuffed before they could even process the raid. Sullivan and his team began the sweep. "Glock 19 on the table," one officer called out. "Baggie, looks like coke. Another one, fentanyl." It was a standard-issue bust. Dirty, depressing, and predictable. Sullivan felt the familiar ache in his lower back. He'd seen this scene 1,000 times. Guns, drugs, and lost souls. He was tired of it. "Clear!" his partner yelled from the main room. Sullivan moved toward the back, his light cutting a beam through the dusty air. There was a small 6-by-6-foot room at the end of the hall, barely a closet. The door was secured with a heavy-duty padlock. "What's in here, guys?" Sullivan asked the man in cuffs. The suspect, a skinny man with haunted eyes, just shrugged. "Nothing." "Storage." Sullivan didn't like the feel of it. He motioned for the bolt cutters. The lock snapped, and he pushed the door open. The stench hit him first, a sharp, stinging ammonia that burned his nostrils, mingled with the foul odor of old, wet newspaper. He flicked on the room's single fly-specked bulb, and his heart stopped. It wasn't a room. It was a cage. In the far corner, on a filthy pile of rags, 2 yellow eyes glowed in the sudden light. They weren't the eyes of a dog or a house cat. They were the eyes of the wild. "Sweet Mary," Sullivan whispered, lowering his flashlight. A young bobcat, no bigger than a beagle, was pressed so far into the corner it seemed to be trying to merge with the drywall. It was frozen, not in aggression, but in pure, unfiltered terror. Its body was wire-thin, the points of its hips visible beneath a dull, matted coat. Sullivan's eyes scanned the grim space. An overflowing litter box, a single chewed-up plastic dog toy, and a shallow water dish coated in green slime. He weighed, as they would later learn, barely 14 pounds. A 10-month-old baby, who should have been learning to hunt rabbits in a snowy forest, was instead locked in a box, breathing in the residue of fentanyl and despair. "Mike, what is it?" his partner called. Get animal control." "Now," Sullivan said, his voice thick. He couldn't take his eyes off the animal. He squatted low, trying to make himself small. "Hey there, fella," he murmured. "We're not gonna hurt you." The bobcat didn't hiss. It didn't move. It just stared, its small body trembling so violently Sullivan could see it from the doorway. He saw the guns and the drugs on the table outside, and he felt the usual professional anger. But looking at this animal, he felt something else. A deep, profound shame. This was a different kind of crime. A wound to the spirit that felt colder than the February air. Then, he saw its paws. He squinted, his heart sinking further. The front paws were wrong. They were rounded, scarred, and unnatural. "They declawed him," Sullivan said, standing up abruptly. "They took his claws." He backed out of the room, pulling the door almost shut, leaving it just cracked. He turned to the cuffed suspect and grabbed him by the front of his hoodie, ignoring his partner's warning shout. "You bought a wildcat and declawed it?" Sullivan's voice was a low growl. The suspect flinched. He was scratching up the drywall. Bought him off a guy on Craigslist, just a pet. Lynxie, we called him. Lynxie, a name as cheap and flimsy as the plastic toy in that dark, poisoned room. Sullivan let him go, disgusted. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had seen too much, that this animal was doubly doomed. Robbed of his claws, he was robbed of his wildness. He could never hunt, never climb, never defend himself. He was a ghost, trapped between the world he was born for and a human world that had only shown him cruelty. Law enforcement removed the guns, the drugs, and the criminals. But the hardest question remained, hanging in the icy air. Where could a broken wild heart possibly go? Sarah Jenkins, the animal control officer who arrived on the scene, was used to hard cases. She'd handled starving dogs, hoarded cats, and even the occasional escaped reptile. But the call for one bobcat juvenile at a crime scene was a first. She was a professional, but the sight of Lynxie in that 6-foot box tested her composure. She netted him gently, her movements slow and practiced. The animal gave one terrified, spitting hiss, a sound so weak it barely registered, before collapsing into the net, exhausted and defeated. At the local emergency vet, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. "It's a butcher job," Dr. Evans said grimly, examining the bobcat's paws under a bright light. The animal was sedated, his small, tufted ears relaxed for the first time in months. They didn't just remove the claw, they took the entire last knuckle. Probably with wire cutters or pliers. It's infected, and he's been walking on these painful stumps. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. "He's 10 months old, you said? And only 14 pounds. He's severely malnourished," Dr. Evans confirmed, running a hand over the bobcat's ribs. "He should be double this weight easily. He's been living on cheap kibble, if that. His system isn't built for it." The vet gave him antibiotics, fluids, and a meal of nutrient-rich mush, which the cat devoured with a desperate, shaky hunger even in his groggy state. But the good news ended there. "Sarah, I can't keep him," Dr. Evans said, stripping off his gloves. "He's not a domestic. State law says I have to report him to the Department of Natural Resources within 24 hours. Sarah's blood ran cold. And what will they do? What can they do? The vet sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. He's non-releasable. He can't hunt, he can't defend himself, and he's been human imprinted in the worst way. He's a liability. The unspoken word hung between them. Euthanasia. the most likely, practical, and heartbreaking outcome. A creature that had survived hell, only to be rescued and then executed for the crime of being a victim. "No," Sarah said, her voice quiet but fierce. "Not this one. Not like this. Give me 24 hours." For the next 2 days, Sarah lived on black coffee and adrenaline. She sat at her desk, the small bobcat resting in a large kennel behind her, finally quiet on a soft blanket. She called every zoo in the Midwest. "No space. We can't take in rescues of unknown lineage. Sorry, our bobcat exhibit is full." She called state wildlife rescues. "We're only equipped for rehab and release, ma'am. He's not a candidate." "A declawed bobcat? No, we can't take him." With every no, the walls of the small shelter office seemed to close in. She looked back at the bobcat. He was watching her, his yellow eyes tracking her every move, no longer terrified, just vacant. He had given up. "I'm not giving up on you, Lynxie," she whispered, dialing another number from a list she'd found on a niche wildlife advocacy site. A voice answered on the second ring, warm and clear. "This is Tammy at the Wildcat Sanctuary. How can I help?" Sarah took a shaky breath and, for the 5th time that day, she told the whole story. The raid, the closet, the drugs, the declawing, the 14 pounds of starvation, the 24-hour deadline. She talked without stopping, afraid that if she paused, this voice too would say no. When she finished, there was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "A parking lot on Craigslist," the voice, Tammy's, said. It was a statement, not a question, and it was full of a weary anger that matched Sarah's own. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "They're threatening to put him down tomorrow." "They will not," Tammy said, her voice suddenly steel. "He has a home here. We will take him. Can you arrange transport?" Sarah burst into tears, dropping her head onto the desk. "Yes," she choked out. "Yes, we can." Behind her, the little bobcat lifted his head, as if he understood. He let out a tiny, inquisitive sound, a little murp. It was the first sound of hope. The 8-hour drive from Illinois to Sandstone, Minnesota, was a journey between two worlds. A retired trucker named Gus, who volunteered for the hard transports, took the wheel. The bobcat traveled in a secure, warm crate in the back of the transport van. Gus was a man of few words, but he talked to the bobcat the entire way. "Well, son, you're leaving the flatlands," he rumbled, glancing in the rearview mirror as they crossed the Wisconsin border. "Going north, going where you belong or as close as we can get you." The gray slush of the Chicago suburbs gave way to rolling white hills, then to the tall, proud pines of the Northwoods. The air smelled different, cleaner. The bobcat was silent, but Gus could see his eyes in the mirror, watching the trees pass by. He had never seen a forest. They arrived at the Wildcat Sanctuary late at night. The snow was falling in thick, gentle flakes, muffling all sound. Caretakers were waiting, their faces kind, their movements unhurried. They didn't coo or crowd him. They spoke in low, respectful tones. "Welcome home, little guy," one of them said, as they carefully transferred his crate to the sanctuary's on-site veterinary hospital. For the first time, the bobcat was in a place that didn't smell of ammonia or fear. It smelled of pine, clean hay, and other cats. He spent 2 weeks in quarantine, a standard procedure. But here, quarantine wasn't a punishment. It was a spa. He had a warm den, soft bedding, and a diet of high-quality raw meat that his body craved. His infected paws were treated, and the pain began to recede. But he was still Lynxy. He was still the cat from the closet. He would huddle in his den, watching the caretakers with a deep, abiding suspicion. "He needs a new name," said his primary caregiver, a woman named Jess. Lynxy was the name of a victim. He's a survivor. He needs a name that holds hope. They looked at a map, a sanctuary tradition. They traced the route he'd taken, the long drive Gus had made. "Mondovi," Jess said, pointing to a small town in Wisconsin they'd passed through. "It sounds strong." Mondovi. The day came for him to move from quarantine to his own large outdoor habitat. It was the first time he would be truly outside, under the open sky, since he was a tiny stolen kitten. Jess opened the transport crate. The Bobcat, Mondovi, stayed put for a long, long time. "It's okay, sweet boy," she said softly from a distance. "You're safe." He crept out, his belly low to the ground. He stepped onto the wooden platform of his den, and then his paw touched the snow. He recoiled instantly, shaking it, confused by the cold, soft powder. He had never felt earth, only concrete and dirty carpet. He dabbed at it again, like a house cat tapping a new toy. Then he looked up. Above him, there was nothing but a vast gray sky and endless towering pine trees. There were no ceiling tiles, no single buzzing bulb. He could smell the wind. He could hear the call of a crow. He took another step, then another. He sank up to his belly in a soft drift. And then, a flicker of something ancient and wild sparked in his chest. He pounced. He buried his face in the snow, kicking it up with his back legs. He rolled onto his back, batting at the falling flakes. He leaped from a low platform, a clumsy, awkward jump. But it was a jump. He was no longer the cat in the closet. He was Mondovi. Jess watched from the observation window, tears streaming down her face. The broken spirit she had seen 2 weeks ago was mending, right before her eyes. Healing for a soul as wounded as Mondovi's is not a straight line. It is a slow, meandering path, walked with patience. The caretakers at the Wildcat Sanctuary knew this well. They are experts in the language of broken hearts. Mondovi learned the joys of being a bobcat, piecemeal. He discovered that enrichment toys, cardboard boxes scented with spices, or boomer balls he could chase, were far more interesting than a chewed-up dog rope. He learned the chuff, a soft, puffing sound of contentment that bobcats use to greet those they trust. His coat grew thick and luxurious, his weight climbed, and the haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a bright, mischievous curiosity. His world was no longer 6 by 6 feet. It was a sprawling, multi-acre habitat with trees to clumsily climb, platforms to survey his domain, and a cozy, heated den for when the Minnesota winds blew. His mutilated paws would never regrow their claws. He would always be a little unsteady on his feet, a permanent physical scar from his first life. But the sanctuary was built for animals just like him. It was a place where being perfect didn't matter. Being safe and being loved did. He soon discovered he wasn't alone. In the habitat next to him lived Luna, a sleek and sassy female bobcat. Mondovi, full of newfound confidence, would puff himself up and pace the fence line, trying to flirt. He'd try a playful pounce, only to stumble slightly on his scarred paws. Luna, for her part, was utterly unimpressed. She barely gave him a glance, saving her affections for Sebastian, a magnificent, long-legged bobcat who lived on her other side. Mondovi's caretakers watched this one-sided romance with gentle smiles. "It's okay, buddy," Jess would tell him, tossing him a treat. "She's not the one. But your one is coming." They already had a plan. Another young bobcat, a female rescued from a similar situation, was just finishing her own quarantine. Once she was settled, they would begin the slow process of introducing her to Mondovi, in the hope that these two fractured souls could find companionship and heal together. One day, he would have a partner to curl up with, to chase through the snow, to simply be a bobcat with. The story of Mondovi begins with the worst of humanity, the greed of the black market wildlife trade, the casual cruelty of a man who would buy a wild spirit at a highway rest stop and lock it in a box of poisons. It is a story that begins with a deep, aching bruise on the heart, but it ends with the very best of us. It ends with the determined officer who saw a victim, not a monster. It ends with the animal control officer who refused to accept no for an answer. It ends with the quiet trucker driving through the night and the dedicated caretakers who know how to mend a spirit with patience and respect. For the elders who hear Mondovi's tale, the lesson is one they have long cherished. Cruelty may be loud, but compassion is persistent. Love, community, and a safe place to land can heal wounds that seem impossibly deep. Mondovi will never know the freedom of the wild mountains. His birthright was stolen from him on a highway and locked away in a dark room. But today, when he leaps through the deep Minnesota snow, his face coated in white, he is free. He is safe. He is seen, and he is finally, unequivocally, home.